Off the Beaten Track by Phil Owen. Chapter 1. A small metal block drifted silently through the vastness of space. The mass of metal was in fact a spacecraft, albeit a rather basic one, with minimal functions. It was simply a vessel to convey passengers from one place to another. The inside of the spaceship was just as minimalist as the exterior. The corridors were dark and foreboding, the floors were grated and uncomfortable to look at. This was not a home. In a dark chamber, 4 transparent tubes were housed. The contents of the tubes were obscured by condensation. A gentle beeping sound started to ring out, and as it did so, the tubes began to open, revealing a human inside of each. A man with chiseled grisly features lurched into a sitting position, coughing violently. Lights suddenly flickered to life, and the man's eyes squinted in confusion. The man, Commander Andrew Bolt, rubbed his eyes, which were dark brown, almost as black as his short crew-cut hair. Though confused at first, the events of the recent past came flooding back to him. This was all part of the routine revival procedure. Upon agreement to carry out the mission, the crew had all signed the consent forms to be put into cryogenic suspension. This was not normal procedure, but Andrew had been told the provisions were tight, and that the destination was so far from Eden space that the only way to get there with minimal waste of resources was to place the participants into suspended animation. This meant no waste of food, water, and the lack of going into hyperdrive meant that fuel would also be conserved. The journey was meant to have lasted 12 months, a whole year. Many space travelers would have remained conscious and merely lived out the year on board. When Bolt had mentioned this to his superior, Colonel Thorne, the enigmatic man had smiled wryly. Bolt had managed to get himself under control and flexed his stiff muscles. He clambered out of his cryotube. He was wearing a crisp grey uniform, that of a standard Eden Alliance officer. It was surprisingly pristine, given how long he had been wearing it, a whole year. The beeping sound continued to ring out loudly. "Someone switch off the alarm clock, please!" called out the voice of his longtime friend, Max Cooper. As Andrew stood stretching, he looked to the tube to his left and saw Max, grinning at him. Andrew had always thought Max didn't look like a soldier. He looked more like a stand-up comic, all limbs and teeth. His coordination wasn't that great, but he made up for it with his can-do attitude. It had seen him through many missions. As if in answer to his request, the beeping ceased. "Nice nap, huh?" asked Max. "I hate cryo," Andrew said with a dulcet, rasping tone. "Kind of feels like dying. Being born." "You're as cheery as ever," Max remarked. The voice of a young woman spoke out. "Can someone please give me a hand?" said Annabelle, wattling. She was youthful, with a slight frame and cropped blonde hair. Bolt noted that her cryotube hadn't opened all the way, leaving her trapped. He went over to her, barely able to keep steady himself, and prized the tube open fully. He reached out a hand and she took it, allowing him to pull her out of it. "Thanks," she said. Bolt nodded dismissively. "Hey," said Max, "where's the other guy?" Max was looking at the 4th tube, which, though open like the rest, was empty. Bolt eyed it suspiciously. The 4th crew member was the only one he had no previous knowledge of. He had been drafted personally by Colonel Thorne, and when a high-ranking official from Alliance High Command made a decision, it was best not to question it. Still, the man had made Bolt wary. What was his name again? "Henshaw," said Annabelle, as if answering Bolt's unspoken query. "Where is he?" "Maybe he woke up early somehow," Max suggested. "The cryopods were on a timed program. If he woke up early, it was because the ship wanted him to be," Bolt said. He turned and headed for the door, which opened with a metal creak. "Could have been a malfunction," continued Max, following after him. "This ship's a heap of junk. Maybe the timing mechanism was faulty. I wonder how long he's been by himself." Andrew grunted, considering. As he marched through the corridors, his footsteps echoed. He entered the bridge, which was rather small, room for only 4 seats, and their corresponding consoles. He sat on his chair and examined his console, pressing buttons and turning dials. "We were in cryo for a year as planned," he said. Max looked out of the viewport. "So we're in the Remedian sector? The unexplored space? That's the thing about space. It all looks the same." Andrew continued analyzing the readings on his console and stopped, frozen in shock. "What is it? What's wrong?" asked Max concernedly. Look at these readings, Max, said Bolt. Max peered around. His eyes widened. But that's impossible! As he said this, Annabelle stepped lightly onto the bridge. I checked Henshaw's tube. It was rigged with a remote activator. She held up a small circular device with frayed wires. Someone's intentionally woken him up early. Not long, though, as far as I can tell. Maybe a day? She stopped, looking at the two men who paid barely any notice of her. What is it? What's wrong? We're not in the Myrmidian sector, said Max with a tone in his voice that she took to be dread. What do you mean? We must be. That was the whole point. Go to the unexplored section, check for signs of life, establish an outpost, and report back to command. That's the mission, she said, hoping that this was some kind of practical joke. It wouldn't be the first time Max had pulled a stunt like that. Anna, we're not where we're supposed to be, and with what you found on Henshaw's pod, I don't like this, Bolt said grimly. Annabelle squeezed past Max and reached for the console, tinkering. Well, then where the hell are we? She said to herself. A moment later, the look on her face was as pale and frightened as her comrades. Dalek space, she gasped. Yeah, said Andrew. Dalek space. Why would we be in Dalek space? Max asked, panicking. That's a death sentence. Or worse, thought Max to himself. He'd had a friend, Lennox, who'd been captured by Daleks. They hadn't killed him right away, just taken him. And no one ever heard from him again. Max had the unpleasant duty of telling Carl's wife the news. Her tears still haunted him. What do we do, Commander? Anna asked, looking expectantly at Andrew. He looked back at her with fierce eyes. Patch me through to Eden Command. We need to inform them. Henshaw must have hijacked the ship and reprogrammed the destination. They'll send help, he said. Annabelle dashed to her console opposite his and sat, getting to work. Max went to his seat, merely to have somewhere to collapse. I'm trying to establish contact, but it's not working. Interference, maybe? Annabelle was panicking. Max was panicking. It was up to Bolt to keep a clear head. He thought of Colonel Nathan Thorne and his wry smile, of the suspicious Henshaw's absence. Was this all a setup? Colonel, what did you get us into? As he muttered to himself, a light pinged on Max's console. Commander? Max said worriedly. I know this isn't a good time, but we've got incoming. Sure enough, out of the viewport, a small craft could be seen at a distance. Bolt stood up and approached the viewport. Zoom in and magnify, he ordered. Max complied, and the image of a saucer-shaped spacecraft came into view. It's a Dalek ship, Annabelle stated, but they all knew. They'd all been briefed on Daleks. This one looked like one of their small scouting vessels, but that didn't make it any less dangerous. We're being hailed, Max called out. This was it, thought Andrew. There wasn't any way out of this that he could see. He steeled himself and said, Patch it through. Max complied, and the voice echoed loudly through the ship's communication system. But the voice wasn't what Bolt had expected. It wasn't the telltale, grating croak of a Dalek. It sounded human, but with such resolve and commanding tone that it might as well have been. Enemy spacecraft, you are trespassing in Dalek space. Surrender immediately, or you will be exterminated.